hear this from a lot of patients, that in terms of understanding conversations or understanding language, that's very limited. Can you talk a bit more about that, but then also the relationship between having difficulty with understanding language? Is that related at all to generating language? So what I'm really trying to get at is the connection between Broca's and Wernicke's.
Many times I've said to my therapist, I don't understand what you're saying. And it wasn't obscure stuff that he was saying, but it was affectively charged stuff, most likely. I could not get it. I would keep saying that, and what me seemed finally, he said, you really don't get what I'm saying. I said, no. It's like you're speaking Greek, and I can't even understand it as Greek. I can't even understand it as a different language. I've always been a writer. I've always depended on this private process of trying to understand what it is that I'm feeling by pressing down on the writing as far down as I could go. That's part of the reason that the journals, I think, were so evocative, is because I was unrelenting in trying to get it. But that wasn't in conversation with another person. I wasn't having to try to pick up what they were saying and make sense out of it. That would have been a very difficult thing for me to do. That was a difficult thing for me to do. It was more difficult for me to do that when I walked into my therapist's office than if I was at a coffee shop or at a, or as the therapist. It was harder for me with that particular demand characteristic. And I had a therapist who very much appreciated my putting things into words. So I got an extra reward. He liked and it was almost as if he enjoyed the aesthetic of it, that it would touch something in him that made everything a little bit more real, at least for him, and by proxy me, so that realness would develop.
And how much do you think there's a relationship, or maybe you don't think there's a relationship, between the difficulty understanding language and generating language?
I think there's an absolute connection. My own experience with it as for this moment of time, being the patient you guys are interviewing, it's harder for me to know exactly how to describe it because I depended on my ability to put things into words, to stand it at all, to bear it all. But I would say that for a good number of my patients, if I ask them to do journals, the journals I get is, I hate myself, I hate myself, I hate myself, I hate myself, written over and over and over again, right? Or something about as eliminating. It's useless for them to keep a journal. But what I kept a journal for and had to put things into words was to go deeper into what that moment was so that I could understand it as best I could. And that was very much guided by the quality of the therapy that I was in. Every one of my patients that I can bring to mind has increased their vocabulary. Mm-hmm. Vocabulary across the board with training and with therapy. And they probably are unconsciously rewarded too, because I'm very big on, I appreciate words. I appreciate affect, words that allow affect to arise. Mm-hmm. But every one of them, I think, with that combo has gotten smarter, they're more verbal, they understand me better, and they talk with more richness about their own experience. So they write a different journal, but they start not needing to write a journal. Or not, that doesn't, it was a very driven experience for me to put things into words. So, in therapy also, except when I was dissociated or in a fugue state, which was not uncommon, when there were no words for it, which is so common, right? That words completely fail the experience and in fact distort the experience. And then it's just very difficult to put those things into words.
Early in childhood, when you don't have word processing yet, it's a lot of right brain, there's a lot of affect. The only way you can express yourself is through art. But when you have that left brain, that language processing, and you develop those words, that interaction between the right and the left can really help with mediating that affect, that strong affective component. So it's interesting that you say that words have helped a lot of your patients as well.
And there's never a perfect translation. And so every time a patient of mine says there are no words for this, I know exactly what they mean. Mm-hmm. We all have a sense of what that means. There are no words for a lot of this. And it's not because it's disgusting or puerile or horrible, it's because it's being processed, the experience is being held and barely escaping the subcortical right hemisphere. But it wasn't magic either. It wasn't just putting it into words and then it was done. Because words could reinforce the whole problem. It was, okay, now I have words for this. And that hasn't necessarily made it easier. But what it does do is to give you a bridge as a patient. It really gives an advantage to the therapist to know what's going on when you can put things into words. So you're there then in a deeper relationship with the therapist, right? Which has to be sensed and, so I was talking about yesterday, provoked and somehow, if in the deepest places of dissociation, hardly even imagined that presence exists. Mm-hmm. So the therapist has to insist on the presence in the room. At least that was the case for me, and I find that to be true for my patients too. So much of this is pre-verbal. It's experienced pre-verbally. It's coded outside of the cortex. It's coded in frequencies that aren't available to us in our thinking, talking brains. So in every way that these experiences get coded, they're not really available to talk therapy. It's like, other than that, no problem. It's gonna be the relationship, it's gonna be the presence of the therapist that matters so much. And I'm talking about the process that I was engaged in, not developmentally, because I don't even know how this worked for me as a baby, as a very young child. I think until the trauma, I was on line to developmental, and then I fell apart. But in terms of the therapeutic process, it was struggling to perceive, in a certain way, this is true, to perceive the emotion in the emotion, to put it into words. And then so I could describe it. And I required an enormous amount of precision until I was satisfied, not intellectually, until I had named it as close as I could and I would ease the feeling. Think about raising your children, right? Or kindergarten teachers. Right? I'll say put it into words. Right? Mm-hmm. That's vital for mastery, is to move it out of the affect-driven turn the table over part of the brain, right, into some capacity to express the intensity of that affect without expressing the intensity of that affect. And I don't know if that's an assessment. It's a substitution, it's a realization, it's civilization. Like my patient who said, my boundaries feel like birds that fly off when I go to the end. Metaphor, it's metaphor. Metaphor is right hemisphere language. So metaphor allows us to say something is like something else. That's what I would always be looking for, because I had no other way of ever making it understandable to myself, much less understandable to another human being, unless I could use something as conceptually available as my boundaries are like birds that fly away. When I approach my empty home, my empty house, my husband is the perch. Without the perch, it is only sky. Then you know exactly what their experience is, right? But if it was flailing, if it was clutching themselves like this, right? If it, whatever, I mean, you can get it, but you don't get it in the same way that you get it if you, so maybe that's important really to think about teaching metaphor to patients, helping them develop metaphor as the closest language that they're going to have. And that's why we like poets.